Hello and welcome to our webinar as part of the Elevating the Medicaid Enrollment Experience, or EME project. Today we will talk about unwinding the Medicaid continuous coverage provision. My name is Jennifer Wagner, and I'm the Director of Medicaid Eligibility and Enrollment with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. I'm privileged today to be joined by Judy Solomon, a Senior Fellow at CBPP. Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that there's a lot going on right now in DC and around the country, and people may feel understandably a little bit distracted. We recognize that, but decided to still go ahead with the scheduled webinar today because the information is very timely. We're glad you could join us, and we can hopefully provide a little bit of distraction by this deep dive into some weedy Medicaid areas through this webinar. We encourage you to ask questions throughout this time. Please use the Q&A function on the screen to submit any questions that you may have. So for today's agenda, we will start with Judy discussing the CMS guidance that was issued on December 22nd on how states should plan for the resumption of normal operations at the end of the COVID-19 public health emergency. Then we'll take a quick break for any questions that may be out there specific to the guidance. Next, we'll explore some of the opportunities and challenges associated with states returning to regular operations. While we do have concerns about a few pieces of the guidance, overall, it does allow states to restart change actions and renewals in a way that preserves coverage for eligible people and promotes a number of great strategies for streamlining applications and renewals. There's lots of work for you all to do on the ground to make sure that this is implemented well and efforts to ensure access are advanced. We have a lot of content to share today, but hope to have some time at the end for discussion and would be very interested in anything you've heard about your state's plans or questions that have arisen. We also plan on scheduling a town hall later this month to have a more robust discussion on what state plans are, if there's interest. And with that, I'll turn it over to Judy.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be with you today. As Jen said, I'm going to do a high-level overview of the guidance that came out at the end of December on planning for how states should resume normal operations when the COVID public health emergency, which we call the PHE, ends. Now, one thing to put out there is we don't know when that's going to end. So as you'll see as we go through the provisions, that uncertainty presents a little bit of a challenge on how these things will play out. We may know more when the Biden administration takes office. The current 90-day PHA period ends on January 20th. It is almost certain to be, it is pretty certain to be extended. And we're hoping that maybe the Biden administration will give us a little bit more information on how it sees it playing out. But for now, just know that the Congressional Budget Office has assumed it will last into 2022. So for quite a while. Ina, can you advance that? So what the guidance does, as its title says, is give states how they should return to normal activities. It covers a lot of temporary authorities besides eligibility and enrollment, including home and community-based services, health, provider certification. We're not talking about that today. We're going to focus on the eligibility and enrollment provisions that set out the timelines states will have once the PHE ends to complete applications, verifications, redeterminations, and renewal, and tell states what they actually should be doing now to prepare for that and to be in a position to resume operations when the PHE is. There's a requirement for a plan that we'll talk just briefly about. And then there are a number, as Jen alluded to, streamlining opportunities that she is actually going to cover. Next slide. So just a reminder, so we're all in the same place. Most of this unwinding is to unwind the continuous coverage provision that was part of the maintenance of effort requirements states had to meet to qualify for the 6.2 percentage point increase in federal match that they've had since the beginning of last year. That was in the Families First Act back in March of 2020. And what that requires is that states maintain people in Medicaid coverage through the month in which the public health emergency ends, except if someone voluntarily terminates their coverage, they die, they move out of state, or, and this was in recent regulation, the interim final rule that came out in November, or the state determines that the person is not validly enrolled. And just to ease everyone's mind, there's no requirement that the state go through their caseload or do anything special to determine that someone's validly enrolled. But if for some reason the state becomes aware that someone was enrolled fraudulently, if the state terminates their eligibility after providing notice and an opportunity for a hearing, it would not endanger the state's receiving the FMAP bump. Next slide. So let's talk about time frames for what states have to do when the public health emergency ends. They have to finish processing any applications that are still pending within 4 months, but within 2 months for MAGI. Most applications use the modified adjusted gross income. Those have to be done in 2 months, 3 months for disability-related applications, and 4 months for all others. Those would primarily be probably long-term care applications for seniors. They must complete post-enrollment verifications, act on changes in circumstances, redetermine eligibility when they've gotten information that suggests someone had a change in circumstance, and complete renewals, all within 6 months at the end of the, within 6 months at the end of the PHE. And then they must, after that 6-month period, resume timely processing on everything. So with the timelines, I think you can see that there are significant questions on how this work is going to get done. And how it gets done is going to have a major impact on whether eligible people can stay covered, both at the end of the PHE and moving forward. As Jen's going to walk through, there's ways to make it more or less likely that people stay eligible, but these timeframes are pretty aggressive and there'll be a lot of work to be done. So to prepare for that, there's a number of things states can and should be doing now during the PHE rather than waiting to address all their workload when the PHE ends. They obviously should be processing applications. That should be a primary focus of processing applications during the PHE. While states have had, many states have leeway not to meet the usual 45-day requirement, it would, we would emphasize the need to get those applications processed as soon as possible. And there's, not much reason not to do that. Many states have adopted post-enrollment verification, which means basically that someone attests to the information and attests to income, for example, that shows they are eligible and provides coverage and uses electronic data sources or other forms of post-enrollment verification to confirm their eligibility. So all of that should continue because that can give people a full eligibility period going forward. They have to verify citizenship and immigration status. There is a statutory requirement that if that can't be done through the Social Security Administration or the SAVE system for immigrants. They need to set a 90-day reasonable opportunity period of eligibility and continue efforts to verify. They definitely should do ex parte renewals as possible. And many of you have probably seen Jen's paper where she talks about that. If they can use a data source, get someone covered, push that date out a year, it obviously helps the enrollee, and it also helps the state in terms of later staggering their workload. And the guidance tells state, to the extent possible, that you should process changes in circumstances, which usually requires reaching out to people, as well as renewals where you have to obtain information. But again, that would be to the extent possible. If there's no success during this period, everybody is covered. Next slide. The guidance gives states some options for setting dates, setting the dates that a person would have renewal done the next time. If the state completes an ex parte renewal, they can use, and this is all to stagger so that when we're finished with the PHE, everybody doesn't have the same month of renewal. So for example, if someone was scheduled for renewal in October of last year, but in January this month, the state does an ex parte renewal, what the guidance says is you can use that October date and use that as the date, and so the person would be up again this October. But if you try ex parte renewal and it's unsuccessful, but you reach out and get information that shows the person's still eligible in January, you would have to give them the full 12 months. So they could not be required to go through the renewal process until next year. The guidance also recommends that if they get a report of a change in circumstance, reach out, find the person still eligible, rather than just keeping them on and keeping their renewal date, which could be, a couple months from now, that you start a new eligibility period. Again, all of this will help stagger the workload and also, in some cases, mean that the workload won't be as much when the PHE ends. So this is the part of the guidance that's most troubling to me. We've, in the language of the provision, says that people shall remain eligible till the end of the PHE. So our read on that has been that at the end of the PHE, there should be a determination of whether someone remains eligible, regardless of anything that may have happened in the interim. But what the guidance does is basically say that if a state found someone ineligible within 6 months before the PHE ends, they can act on that. So what it says, so for example, they get a report that someone has higher income, they reach out, the person sends something, and yes, indeed, they have higher income, they determine they're ineligible, they send a note, they have to send a notice, they have to tell them that their eligibility is going to end at the end of the PHE, and also they should report any changes while they're still enrolled. When the PHE ends, all they would then have to do is send the 10-day advance notice and hearing rights that their coverage is being terminated. For people, let's say the same example, they reach out to the person, but they don't reply, they don't answer, they don't send in any information. If that occurs within 6 months, the guidance says you can terminate eligibility after the PHE ends, but you have to allow, say that happened in month 3, the person comes back and says, oh, here's the information, you have to act on that and use that. So you can't terminate them. But if they don't respond, never respond, you can just send them a notice and terminate them at the end of the, as long as it happened within 6 months. You can see that that creates some sort of funny issues, because until we actually know when the PHE ends, you don't know counting backwards. And a lot of people will get these notices saying that their coverage is going to end, when really maybe it isn't, because the PHE extends beyond 6 months of that notice. So it's a little sticky. And as I said, this was the thing that, personally, I liked the least in the guidance. And we'll all be interested in hearing your thoughts on it. Next slide. So this is, I think, a good thing. States have to provide, prepare an operational plan. There's a tool forthcoming. I expect that tool will say when this has to be done. It's not something that the state has to provide to CMS as a matter of course, but CMS may ask for it. So I think this is something that advocates can work with their states on to figure out, especially when you hear from Jen on some of these streamlining things the states can do. It's a real opportunity to set ourselves up for the end of the PHE. States are supposed to take a risk-based approach to their workload, and there's 4 possibilities. One is population-based. So people who are most likely to be ineligible, these would be people who, aged out of coverage or otherwise are likely to no longer be eligible. Time-based, the length of time, the cases pending for the longest time. A hybrid approach of population and time-based, an approach the state develops. So it's pretty wide open. The state can decide but it would have to be described in this plan. So lastly, just a few odds and ends. The guidance does make it clear, and this is something that's required now but doesn't always happen, that the state is responsible for people who are no longer eligible to ensure that they can transition to other coverage programs for which they may be eligible. And that would be for children going into CHIP, for adults and children going into the marketplace, or in the 2 states with behavioral health, basic health programs, Minnesota and New York into basic health. Also provide states with protections from program integrity actions, PERM and MEQC, if they finish their actions within the time frame. So that's helpful to states not to have to worry that they're going to be dinged in all of these areas. And then finally, and this is where I think I turn it over to Jen, it does have a lot of recommendations that can streamline eligibility, both after the PHE ends, but after that as well. So I think this is a time to really think about the kinds of workloads and the danger that we have, that people are going to lose coverage at the end of the PHE, to really renew our work on that. I know many of you on the call have never stopped since the enactment of the ACA, working on streamlining, and many of you before that. So I think this is another point at which we really, really can renew those activities. So I think we're going to do questions, if there are any, and then go to Jen.
Thanks, Judy. We did have a question come in. The question is, California said they await a CMS toolkit before beginning planning on implementing the 1222 CMS guidance. What do we know, if anything, about the timing and content of that toolkit?
I actually don't know. I would expect it to be coming soon, but we can actually try to see if we can get some info on that and then pass it along in a follow-up email. It's a really good question. I can sort of see what the state wants to see the template. On the other hand, there's a lot of stuff here that you can start with now. I don't think you have to wait for the toolkit. The guidance, I mean, a lot of the guidance, if you've looked at it and you see how long it is, don't be intimidated. It actually, a lot of it is explaining the rules that exist, and it's a nice little compendium of all those rules on renewal with all the citations. So I'm going to hold on to it just for that as a reference. So yeah, but we'll try to find out if that's the state's position. You would want to know that.
And another question came in: if the PHE was extended by the Biden administration, would the timing follow?
Yeah, I think this, I don't think that this in any way assumes, because as we all know, we are still deep in the public health emergency. There's no assumption here that the PHE is ending on Inauguration Day. I mean, it hasn't been extended by the Trump administration yet. You know, they likely will, but if they don't, I would think it would be a day one, that day action by the Biden administration. So yes, you know, I think that the people who wrote this are people who are going to be there. So yes, it applies. It will apply. Now, maybe there can be some tweaks. We would like to see a change in the timing. We would like to see a little bit more emphasis on state's obligation, and Jen will probably talk about this, to follow up on return mail rather than, you know, terminate people. So, you know, I think the framework will be in place. You know, maybe there are opportunities to improve it. And that's one of the reasons we want to have the town hall follow-up, is we want to really hear from you all what your thinking is as you look at this and how it will play out in your states. So we'll do that in the town hall, but in the interim, feel free to reach out to us with thoughts. Yeah, I'm sorry, you broke up. I couldn't hear the question.
Apologies, a little technical issue on my end. The question is much of this guidance likely to change in the new administration?
No, as I just said, I doubt it. I doubt that much of it will change. I mean, there may be some tinkering, but I doubt it.
And do you anticipate that we will see a significant shift away from tying flexibilities to the PHE, since the end date is continuously changing?
No, I don't. I mean, I know there's some issues around some of the home and community-based service, you know, in terms of how long they can last, but I don't see that. You know, there is always the possibility. I mean, the continuous coverage provision and the other elements of the maintenance of effort provisions, including the prohibition on more restrictive eligibility conditions and processes, is in statute. You know, that can change. It might change as states, you know, as the PHE continues, particularly around negotiation, but we have no inkling that that's going to happen. So I think, you know, for people, since this question seems to be coming up, I think just take this guidance and run with it. Assume this is what we're dealing with. It may be tinkered with, but I wouldn't see any major changes.
Do the 2 sets of FAQs released by CMS yesterday change anything that's been stated so far?
No. Although I'm looking at Jen because I think she gave it a closer read than I did. She's nodding no.
No, it's useful information, especially for pregnant women and for certain immigrants. There's an interesting answer in there, but it's not directly related to these issues. It doesn't change anything.
The next question: are states required to follow the guidance for terminating coverage for enrollees who have a determination of ineligibility or don't respond to an information request within 6 months? Or could we advocate that our state do redeterminations for all members with current information at the end of the PHE?
Yes, the latter. It's not a requirement. It's a flexibility, I would say, for the state to decide whether they take it up. And that's a really great question and point in that question.
And the guidance that states that states can terminate people based on a 6-month-old determination of ineligibility seems to be inconsistent with old CMS guidance that a termination must be based on current ineligibility as determined after consideration of all sources of eligibility. Is the guidance on this point compatible with due process?
I would argue that it's not, for the reason, the regulation, but also the language of the PHE of the Families First provision itself, which is very clear that the person is basically treated as remaining eligible, and that language to me triggers the need for a new determination. But that's me speaking. That's the guidance says something different. So.
And the last question we have for this section, could you reiterate whether you said the PHE is likely to continue through all of 2021?
So what I said is we don't know, but the Congressional Budget Office in its estimates and has most recently estimated, because they don't know either, that it would continue into 2022. I think it was March, was just the ballpark. So you can't, it's just an estimate to give you a sort of sense of what we're talking about, which is that for now, a lot of what's in this guidance, the important part is to kind of set up for the end, but also look at those things that are supposed to be done now. And Jen will talk more about this, and she has a wonderful paper really going in that preceded the guidance, explaining the best practices for what states can do now on ex parte renewal and so on, that will help the state in terms of staggering their workload, but also make it more likely that eligible people can stay covered. So we probably should just go to her, because I think she's going to cover a lot of that, good stuff.
And just as a reminder, we'll take questions again at the end. So just continue to send us your questions using the Q&A function.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Judy, for that digestion of a really long piece of guidance and really highlighting the main things that we need to know, and for all of those great questions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the opportunities and challenges associated with the resumption of normal operation after the public health emergency ends. So the first thing to really look at is, what is your state doing now in order to determine what they have to change in the immediate future and how things are going to look at the end of the PHE. It's important to understand what actions they're taking right now. And there's kind of a range that we've seen. Some states have stopped everything. They've stopped periodic data matching, acting on changes and renewals, and are just letting everyone stay on the program and not even touching the cases. Other states are conducting some ex parte renewals, the automated renewals based on data sources or other automated processes. But if those aren't successful, they're not sending requests for information. They're just kind of stopping there. Similarly, some states are transitioning enrollees to other categories of coverage where appropriate. So if somebody turns 19, turns 65, things like that, they're kind of catching up a little bit where they can. Then on the other end of the spectrum, some states are conducting almost all the actions and going all the way up until termination, but they're just suppressing that termination at the end. And so this kind of situates states a little bit differently. So I encourage you, obviously, if you're in conversations with a state, to get some more information about what they're doing right now, but also to look at policy releases or other memos on the state website, to chat with direct service providers or enrollees and see, are you getting a renewal notice? What are you being told about this? Because again, that will set us up for kind of a discussion about what to do next. So building on what Judy said about what state actions need to happen during the public health emergency, some of this is kind of prescribed in the CMS guidance. Some of it are things that you might have to push the state to do a little bit. So first of all, the state should process what can be done. Applications We think that most states have been keeping up with applications for the most part, but some of the language in the guidance seem to suggest that some states might be slacking a little bit in that area. So let's make sure that states are doing applications. In April, it might have been tough as they were rushing to remote work, but we've been in this situation for a long time and people need benefits. Similarly, post-enrollment verification. If states have enrolled individuals based on the self-attestation, they may have stopped doing the post-enrollment verification, the data checks after the person's been enrolled, because even if those data checks fail, the person can't be kicked off. So they might have just deferred that. But in many cases, that post-enrollment verification can be completed electronically without bothering the client. And the state can just kind of check that off the list, so it's not in that really big pile of work waiting at the end of the PHE. Similarly, ex parte renewals. We don't want to necessarily bother people with requests for information, especially when we can't act on it. But if the state can do an automated renewal based on those data sources and get those people current, so they're not in that pile of work at the end of the PHE, that's beneficial for everybody. And transitions to other coverage groups where appropriate. As many of you know, the interim final rule contains some parameters as far as when somebody can be transitioned to other coverage groups. They have to be essentially left no worse off. But there are opportunities where states can kind of clean up the roles a little bit in a way that's not too harmful to people and get them into the appropriate coverage group. Other things state needs to do, they really need to look at updated enrollee contact information. We know that it's really hard to keep current information in the best of circumstances. But right now, people are unfortunately probably moving more than usual, especially if there are evictions happening, losing cell phone access and things like that. So what can they do to update enrollee contact information? And that should include not just sending a notice and if it's returned saying, oh, I don't know where they are, but text messages, email reminders, coordinating with managed care organizations that might have more up-to-date information, public messaging. Some governors and agencies are talking to the public every day. Let's flip this in sometime. Give us your current address. Look to other programs like SNAP that may have been in closer contact with clients to get the current information. The next one I put in parentheses because it has to do with Judy's point about if somebody was found ineligible within the 6 months prior to the end of the PHE, the state could act on it. We first of all don't want states to do that, but if they are going to do it, they have to send a notice of finding of ineligibility with specific information, such that your coverage will continue through the end of the month in which the PHE ends, and that you should report any changes. So if the state is going to kind of take that option, they need to be developing appropriate notices right now. The last group of things are overall things to improve the system and operation, which were important before, are even more important now as there's this public health crisis, and are going to be absolutely essential at the end of the PHE and beyond when there's a lot of work pending. So where can state agencies take a tiny breath right now and make some fundamental improvements to their system? Communications with clients like text messages and emails. In some cases, states may have kind of done it on the fly during the PHE. Let's make that permanent, or let's figure out what worked and didn't and how we can use that in an ongoing way. How can they improve ex parte renewals? You'll see a range across states from not doing any ex parte to over a 75% success rate in renewing cases automatically. Many states have a whole lot of room for improvement there, and that will help at the end of the PHE and beyond. There are plenty of opportunities for coordination with SNAP. Some of the waivers for food stamps or SNAP have been a little bit different than Medicaid, and they've kind of come and gone. States have implemented them differently. And what that means is that a lot of agencies are in contact with people through SNAP. So they're getting current addresses. They're getting current information that could allow the state to push forward the Medicaid based on the SNAP renewal. So how can we leverage that information to update cases now? And there's a lot of opportunities to transition, a lot of opportunities for improvement regarding transitions to other coverage groups or marketplace. Like we said, there's always been an obligation on states to do this, but some have done it very poorly. And instead of kind of a trickle month after month, there's going to be a huge number of individuals that may need to transition coverage groups or move to the marketplace after the PHE. So let's get those processes tightened up a little bit. Now, the state also has some decisions to make for the end of the PHE. Sometimes if they're going to take the flexibility or not, how much they're going to use it and in what way. One of the key things is really planning out what they're going to do with the cases at the end of the PHE. Unfortunately, the guidance does not require that the state do a fresh renewal for everybody based on current information. So a state may instead do a redetermination. A redetermination is usually based on a data match. They run their caseload against quarterly wage data, and anybody who might appear ineligible gets a 10-day notice. They have 10 days to respond, and that leads to a high rate of procedural denials. People don't get the notice, don't understand it, don't return it. The agency sends out so many that they can't process the inquiries and the responses. We've seen that in states like Arkansas after they got really behind on doing renewals. So that is in contrast to a full renewal that requires a state to try to do it ex parte using data sources. If they can't do it ex parte, it requires a state to send out a pre-populated renewal form. The client has 30 days to respond. If they don't respond and lose coverage, there's a 90-day reconsideration period where they can provide the necessary documents and restart coverage without a new application. That is a far from foolproof process, and there's a lot of danger for eligible people losing coverage, but it's much better and the client protections are much stronger for renewals versus redeterminations. So a huge opportunity to say to the state, let's do renewals for everybody and make sure we get it right. Next, the timeframes. The CMS guidance says states can stagger the case actions over 6 months. That's good. We would have loved 12 months, but 6 months is something, but it doesn't require the state to use that whole time frame. We're concerned about states facing strong budget pressures or other pressures moving too quickly and trying to do too much at once in a way that clients can't process everything they're getting and the state can't process the responses. As Judy mentioned, there's a required risk-based prioritization of work. This can be done really well. This can take those individuals who maybe have a match in the quarterly wage data and prioritize them for renewal in the first month or two, or take individuals with a high likelihood of change in income and push off elderly, disabled, children who are very likely to still be eligible. So how can we use this in order to make a very logical and stepwise resumption of normal activities? Another opportunity here to talk about coordination with SNAP. The guidance says that if a SNAP renewal is due within, a SNAP recertification is due within 6 months of the end of the PHE, then the state can just wait to do the Medicaid renewal or act on any change to do it in conjunction with SNAP. That's a huge opportunity. Plus lots of other things we'll talk about around using SNAP enrollment to do the actual Medicaid renewal and other opportunities to leverage that enrollment information. And what is the state planning around stakeholder engagement and communication with enrollees? The state should really be planning to engage managed care organizations, other community-based organizations, and letting them know ahead of time. This is what's going to happen. This is when it's going to happen. We need your help informing clients of what they have to do, getting current addresses, things like that. How is the state going to communicate with enrollees? And again, this should be more than a single notice that's just sent out and left for the enrollees to figure out. What notice will they get that this is going to happen? What to expect? These are things that the state can plan for now so that they're in a good position at the end of the PHE. Now, throughout this, there are a lot of opportunities. You know, COVID has blown up a lot of things, including some Medicaid operations. So let's rethink how we operate Medicaid and see where there's an opportunity to continue things that worked during the pandemic. A lot of states have relied an increasing amount on self-attestation. Did the world end or did things go fine? Let's continue that after the PHE. Post-enrollment verification, as we discussed, that's an opportunity to get people on quickly and do some of the data matching on the back end. Some states have done really creative things for their non-MAGI population, for their elderly and disabled around income disregards. There's also presumptive eligibility. States have increased the number of entities that can determine PE and really expanded that. All of these things are available in normal circumstances. Now, many states did it through a disaster relief, verification plan change, or a disaster relief SPA. That authority will end, mostly in conjunction with the PHE, but the state can submit a regular SPA or a regular waiver request or verification plan addendum, and that will require going through the normal procedures, but it's still available to the client, to the state. The continuous coverage provision, that's unique. States can't really elect to keep doing that after the PHE. That one is off the table. But most of the other kind of streamlining enrollment things that states have done can continue. But states need to plan now and go through the regular procedures to make that happen. There are a lot of opportunities to leverage streamlining here. Again, in conjunction with the end of the PHE, but going forward to streamline things in the long term. So if a state is processing a change in circumstance and reviewing all the client's circumstances, they can also complete a renewal then and push forward the Medicaid certification 12 months. The CMS guidance promotes in numerous places the facilitated enrollment SNAP plan option. That's a super catchy name for what was previously known as Strategy 3 or SNAP to Medicaid, where we use the fact that somebody's enrolled in SNAP to do the Medicaid renewal. And also the guidance promotes a reconsideration period for a change in circumstance. So as you may know, after renewal, if a renewal is not done successfully and the client submits the required information within 90 days, that can be processed as an application without requiring a new application. The guidance says, let's do that for change in circumstance also. So if a client doesn't respond to a 10-day notice, loses coverage, but then comes back in and provides the requested information, they can be reinstated without having to complete a new application. So these are things the current CMS is promoting. So a great opportunity to kind of have these conversations with the state about things that can be done. Additional things in the guidance have to do with streamlining for stable populations. They promote for children using express lane eligibility that allows an application to be processed or a case to be renewed based on enrollment in other programs like SNAP or TANF. The guidance also promotes continuous eligibility that'll keep somebody enrolled during this 12-month certification period, even if there is a data match, even if the family experiences a change in income that would make them otherwise ineligible. So another great opportunity for conversation. And finally, there's a lot of streamlining opportunities around the non-Magi population. And these really don't get enough attention. And they are very nicely packaged and promoted within this guidance. Non-Magi population, they can have 12 months renewals like the Magi population. Some states are renewing more frequently, which is kind of silly because generally these individuals have very stable income and circumstances. A lot of things that were done to streamline Magi can be brought over to the non-Magi population, like using pre-populated forms and giving them a reconsideration period after the renewal. Should also be using maximizing the use of ex parte renewals for the non-Magi population. There's a new asset verification system that states are using that should facilitate ex parte renewal by providing electronic verification of resources. States should accept case information unlikely to change, things like pension and other types of income. States can modify their verification policies for the non-Magi population by accepting self-attestation more often. And finally, a long-standing opportunity, but kind of a tough nut to crack, is aligning Medicare savings program and low-income subsidy eligibility criteria to streamline that enrollment that was, set up a few years ago to be streamlined, but hasn't been fully utilized by states. So another flag of things to consider as states resume normal operations. But fundamentally, there's advocacy needed in all of these different areas. There's no requirement to conduct fresh renewals for all enrollees. They could rely on this data matching and just send a 10-day notice. They could terminate based on determination or non-response within 6 months of the end of the public health emergency. Those are things that are going to lead to more eligible people losing coverage. And so it's up to you guys to work with the state and convince them that the proper action is to conduct fresh renewals for everybody. There's also no obligation on the state to follow up on returned mail. In fact, there's been some pretty bad guidance put out by this administration on canceling people if a piece of mail is returned. They're generally protected right now by the continuous coverage provision, but it's kind of a bad precedent and guidance to states. So how can you work with states to update addresses on the front end and take more proactive action if mail is returned? Again, even if the state's doing a great job and staggering things out at the end of the PHE, this is a whole lot of notices, a whole lot of information being sent out, and it's going to be hard to reach people. So we've got to kind of take things to the next level to make sure we're actually contacting clients. And finally, the guidance allows states up to 6 months to catch up, but in theory, a state could try to renew everybody right away or in a month or two, and that could lead to a lot of procedural denials and loss of coverage for eligible populations. So again, this guidance is better than expected. Obviously, our expectations have been lowered greatly during 2020 and during the past couple of years. But there's really a lot in here that not only is promoting good information, but it's really an opening to bring to your state and say, hey, CMS says do this, let's talk about this, and a chance to kind of restructure the program in a little bit so that the end of the PHE goes smoothly and that things are improved in the long term. So with that, we'd love to have a discussion, answer any questions that you have about these opportunities, anything else about the guidance, and also to hear from you all about what you're hearing. Obviously, this guidance came out right before the holidays. People may have been off. I'm not sure if the states have really fully processed this yet, let alone communicated to you their plans. But it's really going to be interesting to see how states are responding, what the opportunities are, or what some of the tricky aspects of implementing this are.
Thanks, Jen. We don't have any questions at the moment, but if you'd like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A function. You can also raise your hand by clicking on raise hand, and we can unmute you if you'd like to ask your question out loud. Question that came in, is there any index of state actions that, that are consistent with your recommendations?
Really, this guidance it contains a lot of these opportunities to kind of streamline. We're also hoping that the new CMS will put out a toolkit or something that will really highlight all these opportunities that have long been in existence, but not been taken advantage of fully by states. There are also a lot of nuances. So, you know, the regulations say renew somebody ex parte. That sounds great, but when a state actually gets into it and tries to design their system, they have to decide, what if there's one employer on the case and there are two in the data sources? What about interest income that can't be electronically verified? There are seemingly endless scenarios that they've got to go through. And so hopefully the new administration can provide some more detailed guidance that will really facilitate implementation of some of these things.
We have one person who raised their hand. So Jill, I'm going to unmute you. So please feel free to ask your question.
Hello, Jill Hankin from Virginia. How's everybody? It seems like from our perspective, we want people to stay enrolled as long as possible through the end of the PHE. But then states are really going to need time to unwind and to make changes that are needed. I'm wondering if there's any thinking about extending the higher FFP beyond the end of the PHE so that states will take their time to do this more carefully, thoroughly, correctly. Because if the federal match just drops, there's going to be pressure to reduce the rolls.
Yeah, hi, Joe. I think that's right. And, you know, separately, there have been major efforts over the last several relief packages to get an increase in the FMAP over and above the current 6.2, but even more importantly, that's tied to the economic impact of the pandemic, which will go beyond the health impacts in all likelihood, and which will be a pressure on states to do exactly what you said. So I think there will be ongoing work on that, certainly now with the new alignment, to continue those efforts. And I think the way that you've tied those things together is really important. The other thing that you know, we may, as we think about, and one of the reasons we want to do this, have these conversations, is, as Jen alluded to, we would like states to have more time to unwind, to get their caseloads in a more staggered place, not to have this kind of pressure, because the pressure is going to be to do shortcuts. There's just no doubt about it. It's going to be, you know, not to follow up on return mail. So yes, concerns are well taken, and I think the, you know, different avenues to try to advocate that, and we will definitely be calling on, you know, we and national partners will definitely be calling on state partners to be part of those efforts.
Thank you.
Marie, I'm going to, oh, sorry, you know what? We have a couple more questions that came in. I'm going to ask these first. Can you provide any more detail on the AVS? Do all states have it? And looks like Rhode Island, there's no evidence that it's in effect.
That's a great question and something that we're actually working on researching a little bit more and hoping to provide some more guidance on. So states have been required for quite a while now to actually have an asset verification system in place, which is essentially an electronic cross-match with banks and credit unions and other banking institutions. And that can be used to kind of check an applicant or somebody at renewal to see if they have resources in excess of the limit. States have taken a long time to get this in place, but most have it now. And the question is how it's being used. So in some states, it's been approached as more of a gotcha, where it's one of those data matches that's run during the certification period, and you catch people who have unreported assets. But there's also a huge opportunity to use that proactively. And at application, use that to verify eligibility, to streamline approval processes for non-Magi population. Many states haven't attempted ex parte renewal for the non-Magi because they say we need to verify their resources and have no electronic source, so we have to send a paper document to everybody. So there's a big chance to use that going forward. And so we're working on and hoping to put out something in the next couple of months that will provide a little more guidance and best practices on that.
And to clarify from the CMS guidance, if a state wanted to check whether a person was enrolled properly during the PHE, could they do so? And could they act upon information that indicated the person was not properly enrolled and initiate termination? Would a wage check qualify as a means by which to show improper enrollment?
No, I mean, the criteria is if they were not validly enrolled back in March when Families First took effect. And that could mean like a system error that failed to cut them off or approved a case that shouldn't have been approved. It also includes fraud or abuse, but pretty high standards for what constitutes fraud or abuse, not somebody just entering the wrong income. And there's no obligation to go back and review everybody. I don't know how you would even review every determination from like January, February, March of last year. That's just not kind of an existing process for that. So it's a very narrow exception, and CMS has said to presume that everybody's validly enrolled. And it's restricted to when Families First took effect. So if you had a data match in August of 2020 saying that somebody had higher income, that has nothing to do with the validity of their enrollment in March. So I know that those words have kind of sparked a lot of speculation and concern, but we see those being very narrowly constrained to pretty exceptional circumstances.
And one more question that came in, is the 6-month grace period really understood to mean that states must catch up and resolve their current backlogs during that period? What room is there in the guidance to argue that the 6-month period is when states can begin to process anew going forward, forgiving their backlog?
That's a great question. Kind of, is it 6 months, do you have to get it all done in 6 months, or do you have 6 months to kind of get started and ramped up? Unfortunately, the guidance is pretty clear that you have 6 months to get it all done and to be current by the end of the 6-month period. There may be an opportunity in the future to prompt extending that in some way to give states a little more time. But I think you kind of touch on a really important issue, that this doesn't happen instantly. We think of 6 months, okay, it's kind of double the workload for each month that it normally would be because you're taking all the population over 6 months instead of 12 to review them. But what we have to keep in mind is the lead time to get some of these things started. And especially with the uncertainty of the end of the PHE, that's tricky. If you look at an ex parte renewal, most of those processes start in the system over 60 days before the certification period ends. So if the PHE ends kind of without warning on the 20th of a month, it's actually over 2 months before you really get the process going and could fully renew somebody. And so that would compress timeframes even further. And that's assuming that you can get the change order in and the vendor takes action immediately and all the stars are aligned. So it's something to really consider and think about as you're working with the states and what may happen and what they need as far as lead time and what that's going to mean to clients and possibly advocating for more flexibility there.
Yeah, I should have mentioned, just for your own reference, on the very last page of the guidance, Appendix E, there's a nice breakout of all the timelines, and it's pretty clear that they're timelines for resolution, not for starting. So it's, yeah, as Jen said, it is compressed.
One more question that we have is, will refugees and undocumented immigrants have the opportunity to get the COVID-19 vaccine? slightly outside the scope, but if you guys have any information.
That's a really good question. I saw disturbing reports of people being turned away from getting it. You know, in Medicaid, which is, you know, kind of what we're focusing on today, it would be through emergency Medicaid, and it's not clear it's within the purview. I would say under public health programs, the answer should be yes. But yeah, I mean, I was appalled, given that having everyone vaccinated is in everyone's interest. So I think it's really going to be a public health function in wherever you live, and community health centers and elsewhere. The vaccine is free. People should not be charged for the vaccine. It's the administration. That's the cost.
Great. Thank you so much, Judy and Jen. There are no further questions, so I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Ina, and thanks everyone for being here and for those great questions. Please keep in touch with us as you hear more about what's happening in your state. And as I mentioned, we'll set up something for later this month to just have more of a kind of discussion and talk about all these complicated aspects of implementation of this. So thanks for participating in this Emmy webinar, and we look forward to talking with you in the future. Have a great day, everyone.